when I went to Amherst, some years after I was out of Amherst College, and I was visiting at MIT in 1962, 1963, I already heard about Joe Stiglitz, this wunderkind coming out of Amherst College, and I thought, my God, I've only had 2 or 3 years of time of being the hotshot from Amherst College. And that continued over the rest of my life. Joe was, generally speaking, first, and I was a follower. I remember I first met the legendary Joe at Yale when I was still an assistant professor, probably an associate professor at Yale, and Joe visited. And we talked about unemployment and wage behavior and incentive wages and efficiency wages and things like that. And that must have been about 1964, 65. Probably Joe was, were probably out of MIT by that time. And then later on, I remember in the, I ran into Joe several times during the, in the ensuing years, but I remember in 1980s, around about in 1983, 1984. I was writing my textbook on political economy, and I was venturing into some new territory in one chapter. And I felt completely alone. There was nobody to talk to. I was probably in Mannheim, in what was then West Germany. And I tried to figure out who to call to talk about this. And I thought, Joe Stiglitz. If there's anybody in this world who will be able to talk to me about this, it'll be Joe Stiglitz. So we talked about the problems that ensue when a little-known company, maybe a new startup, wants to sell shares in itself, and nobody knows anything about this company, and what are the ramifications of that for economics. And over my whole career, I've often found that Joe and I are in the same wavelength, but Joe is so quick that 9 times out of 10, he was ahead of me. Anyhow, it's a very special pleasure to introduce Joe this evening. He's for sure the most brilliant guy we've got, which is no guarantee of being always right. But for sure, he's the most brilliant guy we have. And since I go back so far with Joe, it's a very special pleasure to introduce him to you tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Ned, for that wonderful introduction. The normal topic I've been, as you might have gathered, for the last several years, I've been more or less preoccupied with this economic turmoil that we've been having and continue to have. And I always feel very bad about giving after-dinner talks with that, because it always gives a very bad case of indigestion. So I really appreciate Ned having a conference on a different subject, and one that actually should help digestion. It's about happiness. Now, as Ned was reminiscing about our times together at various points, two thoughts occurred to me. One of them in the context of the current high level of unemployment. I remember at Yale giving a talk in which the title of the talk was The Optimal Level of Unemployment. And Jim Tobin was in the audience, and his face turned red. And for him, the optimal level of unemployment was obvious what the answer was: 0. And the fact that anybody could talk about this subject was the beginning of heresy. And the economics profession was clearly going down the wrong road, which I think he was right about that. Ned and I have had a lot of occasions over the years to be together, but again, apropos this conference, one of the nicest events that we were at was we both performed at the Spoleto Music Festival. Menotti Opera. Do you remember that, Ned? No, I said before, and then I was going to qualify and say it wasn't. Ned could have sung, but we both gave papers. They decided to diversify, and rather than, but as I say, Ned had a legitimate rationale for being there, and I was just an interloper. Well, I'm going to talk about a much narrower set of questions than those that have preoccupied the conference so far. But I hope, as I talk a little bit about these narrow questions, that some broader issues will be raised. And much of what I'm going to talk about is an outgrowth of a commission that President Sarkozy set up, a commission on the measurement of economic performance and social progress that Amartya Sen and Jean-Paul Fitoussi organized with me. And there's this little book which I encourage all of you to look at called Mismeasuring Our Lives. And I'm going to try to explain why what we did raised a lot of interesting questions related to what we've been talking about. The motivation for this work, the work of this commission, and we're having our second anniversary of our report in early October in Paris. And one of the outgrowths of our work is the OECD has established a kind of unit that is pursuing some of these ideas. Well, the basic thing is you might say from an information economist point of view, what we measure affects what we do. What we have information about affects how we look at the world. So it was very natural for anybody interested in information to want to have good information systems. And our GDP is the way we organize data, organize information, and that affects, has a whole set of implicit and explicit effects on policy, how we think. For instance, before the crisis, many countries looked at the rate of increasing GDP in the United States. Many countries in Europe looked at the increasing GDP and said, what can we do to emulate the United States? Now, you don't hear that anymore. There's been a big change in the discourse. But one of the things that was very clear is that GDP per capita was not a good measure of success. And I'll come back to explain why it was a very bad measure of success. President Sarkozy had two particular concerns. One of them was that as a politician, he wanted to know what to do. I mean, obviously, one of the things consistent with what has been talked about political economy, he wants to get reelected. But to do that, he felt, he wanted to meet the concerns of his citizens. And he says he's getting conflicting signals. Everybody says, you're going to be graded on GDP growth. But on the other hand, he knew, at least in France, people care about the environment. They care about a whole set of social amenities, a whole set of other things. And he was getting mixed signals. And he said, isn't there some way that you can give us better guidance of weighing how you think about this? Clearly, GDP is not what people care about. They want something else, and how do we bring it into our discourse? The second thing, motivation, was that he was concerned about a distrust that was growing about statistics, and that distrust about statistics could, he worried, spread to entire government. The notion was government keeps announcing, for instance, in the United States, GDP per capita is going up. And everybody thinks that since GDP per capita is going up, they're supposed to be getting better off. But they look around and nobody that they know is getting better off. People are more, in the United States, more people are without health insurance. Most of the people they know seem to be having lower standards of living, or have to have two people in the family have to work. Standards of living seem to be going down. So the question was, how do we reconcile people's perception with these data? And the answer, of course, is people's perceptions are probably right. Their standards of living are going down for most citizens. And GDP per capita doesn't reflect what is happening to things that people care about in their standard of living. So these are all some of the reasons why President Sarkozy wanted a commission to rethink, or at least begin a rethinking of what was going on. Now, interestingly, when GDP first started to, it was a number, it's hard for our graduate students today to realize, or even general people to realize, that there was a period before GDP. People had income, let me make it clear. They had income before there was GDP, but there was a period before we measured what GDP was, or at least it was measured on a regular basis. And it was really in the aftermath of the Great Depression when people wanted to have a thermometer to measure what was going on in the market that Simon Kuznets and some others came up with this metric. We forget, too, how many arbitrary decisions went into making that GDP measure. So that today we accept it. Our students don't even look typically at how it's formulated, don't realize some of the arbitrary things that go into it and some of the ways in which it should not be used. But the fact is that Kuznets, when it was first being formulated, was very clear this was not a measure of well-being. It was a measure of market activity. And unfortunately, in our society where we want so much to have quantitative measures of success, it's gone from being a measure of market activity to a measure of well-being. And that's where, in a sense, the problems begin. I don't want to spend any more much time bashing the economics profession. I think there's been a full dose of that today. But just to add my little 2 bits to the bashing. Some of you may know, some of you may have had this inflicted on you. There's a methodology in economics called cross-section regressions and sometimes time series regressions, where you look at the performance of different countries, and you your measure of performance is GDP, and you have all kinds of explanatory variables, and people use that to make inferences about what is good policy. And whenever you hear statements coming out of the World Bank or IMF, it typically is based on that kind of cross-section regression. They said, looking across countries that do better in this way, countries that are better and have a better indicator here, do better in GDP per capita. Okay. Well, one of the things that is often done, particularly by conservative economists, is they put as one of the explanatory variables the size of the government. And so the implication is when they do this, it often comes out that the larger the government sector, the smaller, the weaker growth. But there's an obvious reason for that. we don't measure output in the government sector very well. And we measure it in a biased way. We measure output in the government sector by the input. So implicitly, there's no real chance for productivity growth because output is measured by input. And that's because we have no way of measuring the output in the normal way by valuing the services. We don't sell the services. So in a sense, it's implicit in the way we measure things that we get those results. So anybody that does a cross-section regression, you have to be very careful, skeptical of those results, particularly when they say the size of government is bad for economic growth. Well, our commission looked began, of course, in a sense, looking at the standard criticisms, the one I just mentioned. Problems in measuring healthcare is another one, or inequality change. In the case of the United States, for instance, we spend 17% of GDP on healthcare. People care about health. I mean, it's one of the really important things. But it's not the input that you care about, it's the output, which is living longer, living healthier lives. And unfortunately, although the United States spends 17%, those outcome measures are poorer than France, which spends 11%. But it makes it look as if U.S. has a higher GDP because we're wasting all that money. When in fact, if you corrected for that, 1/3 of the difference between France and the United States is accounted for by this mismeasurement of the healthcare sector. Another example is the U.S. actually, one of the things that we don't measure very well is insecurity. Insecurity is one of the things that people care a lot about. Health insecurity, physical insecurity, income insecurity, and our markets don't work very well. We have some kinds of insurance, but very limited. And that's why we have social insurance. But the social insurance isn't in our GDP accounting very well because it's part of the government sector, so it's not well accounted for. Again, in the United States, people have to spend a lot more protecting their property, security guards and things like that. Now, you don't get utility out of having more defense, bodyguards around you. One of the more exciting times I had is when I went to the Philippines, and I had 40 bodyguards. It's nice to have an entourage, but all of them with these machine guns, I'm not sure I felt that good. But that was all part of Philippines' GDP, but I don't think it increased welfare. And the United States excels in expenditures on prisons. We have 10 times the number per capita in our prisons than Europe. We don't treat our prisoners very well, so per prisoner we may not spend as much, but totally we spend a lot on prisons and security. All of that things are part of GDP per capita, but not part of a metric of GDP of well-being. One of my own interest in this field originated when I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and I became very sensitive to the fact that one of the things that we are leaving out is how we were spoiling the environment, environmental degradation, resource depletion, again, not accounted for in our GDP. And so I try to get an initiative to have a much milder redefinition of GDP than the Sarkozy report, but focusing on what has come to be called green GDP. And I realized that I was onto something important when Congress said that if you continue working on that, we'll take away all of your money. And the coal lobby realized that if we started talking about this, rather than subsidizing coal, we might actually try to put a tax on coal. So the best way of stopping this whole discussion was, let's not measure it. There's an example a little bit later on I'll mention. Reagan tried to stop the measurement of inequality because he knew that that was something that was not very nice of what was going on. Well, one of the things, one of the standard criticisms that really goes to the heart of what is well-being is leisure. Leisure is not valued. Now, there was some disparaging remarks this afternoon that maybe the real motivation of Sarkozy was that the French enjoyed all that leisure, and he wanted to justify and say that he had a higher leisure-adjusted GDP. And that was what this report was all about. And it wasn't. That was not very nice of you to say that. But there is something interesting, though, that I do want to bring out. And that is, it relates to, I'm sitting at the table, Keynes. And Keynes wrote an article 75 years ago talking about the issue of how would then his grandchildren spend the productivity dividend. You know, what he observed was that for the first thousands of years of mankind, all their energies went to housing, shelter, clothing, food, subsistence. Quality of life was really pretty miserable, and that would be true. Even a king would be spending most of the energy on these basic necessities of life. And then, really beginning a couple hundred years ago with the Industrial Revolution, for a very elite group, and now increasingly, productivity increases have meant that, for instance, we spend maybe an hour a week making the necessities, and the question is, what would we do with the dividend of what we could do with the rest of our time? And Keynes was pretty pessimistic. He looked around at the leisure classes in England, and he didn't think, he wasn't sure that was, in terms of the expression, a good life. That was going to that the productivity dividend would actually increase well-being. But there's been a fundamental split between Europe and the United States. And Amar, I think, referred to those statistics, that in the United States, we've actually worked more. And in Europe, they worked less. Now, from the point of view of economists, they say, well, these are preferences, and there are income effects and substitution effects, and a priori, you can't tell which is stronger. Why make a judgment about which is better? Well, I'll make one judgment. The world won't survive if the rest of the world imitates the American pattern. The world won't survive the profligate consumption patterns just because of global warming. So ours is not a sustainable pattern. And a move towards more leisure may be part of a more sustainable pattern. But in terms of well-being, one is concerned not just with the amount of time leisure, but also how people spend that leisure and how people can learn how to spend that leisure well. And one of the theories of why the world has diverged in these two different directions is that there's a process called learning by doing. We've learned how to consume really well. And we've got an institutional structure that supports consumption, malls every 5 feet. And so you can't get away from it. Whereas more effort has been placed in Europe, maybe in learning how to consume leisure. And that may certainly taste may affect it. So may be affected. So the bottom line that I just want to raise is that our measures do not reflect, GDP measures don't reflect leisure and don't reflect the quality of leisure, of what we do with that leisure. And making judgments about that is very difficult. As an elite, we can make judgments, but as economists, we feel nervous about making those judgments about how other people spend their time, 5 hours a day on average watching mindless TV, somehow doesn't, where you can actually measure. Somebody made a reference to neural activity. Neural activity actually gets lower than in sleeping when people are watching TV. So it is a kind of, and so maybe we'll come up with measures of an integrated level of brainwave, and actually that has been going down rather than up in America. Well, so those are some of the standard criticisms of GDP, some of the things that we talked about in our commission. There are a lot more. The second area that we talked about was sustainability. And that's really important because GDP is a measure of flow of our consumption, our income today, but it doesn't say anything about sustainability. And that's what the concern of global warming is, that the consumption patterns may not be sustainable. But the obvious example was also consumption in the United States before the crisis. GDP looked like it was reasonable, but behind that GDP, Bob Schiller was trying to point out that was not sustainable. And it was interesting what he said about Geithner not wanting to hear that kind of counter view. The point was that if you look, roughly the bottom 80% of Americans were consuming 110% of their income. And you didn't need to have a PhD, or let alone, or a Nobel Prize to figure out that can't continue. And it was just a matter of time before that came to an end. So, and another way of looking at it, you looked at the prices going up, and you asked what would happen if interest rates returned to anything like normal interest rates. People would have to be spend and on a level part of their income on housing that was clearly not viable. And so again, it was clear that this was not sustainable. So GDP doesn't tell you anything about that. And that has an important point. And that is that there is no single metric that can summarize anything as complex or important describing the human condition. Looking for a single number is a mistake. You want to have a small enough number that you can get your head around it. You want to be able to, you don't want to have 100 million statistics, but you need to have more than one. An example that we talk about is if you took somebody driving a car and they're going 50 miles an hour and they have a gas tank that allows them to go 250 miles, both of those are important information. But if you add the 50 and the 250 together in a number called 300, it means absolutely nothing. You have a nice index of nothing. And so there is a sense in which there's a limit of the extent to which you can summarize the relevant statistics into one number. You have to have a dashboard. And that's particularly important when the way we aggregate, the way we bring things together is through using prices. But prices for the future are very uncertain and can be very wrong, as we saw in the real estate. Because you're talking about the price, one of the important prices, the price of carbon. We know the price of carbon is wrong, zero. We don't know what it ought to be, but we know the price of carbon emissions of zero is a wrong number. And everything derived from that, therefore, is wrong. So we know our price system is wrong, and that becomes increasingly important if we go to the future, because we will be changing prices, but the market doesn't yet evaluate it. The second thing reason this is important to bring out this, you might call it dashboard view, is that, and was brought out in some of the discussion this afternoon, different people have different values. They care about different things. And so summarizing in terms of one person's value may not be adequate for describing their sense of how well society is doing. They may want to know what would happen if we have different weights. And that's why the OECD is constructing a website where you could put in your own weights. They'll have different metrics, like on health and various metrics, health and education and various things that are important, longevity and so forth, income. And then you can add them up in different ways, and you can see how well your country is doing relative to others using your judgments, not some statistician in a statistical office. Well, the final group, the final subcommittee of our commission focused on, in some sense, the one that most related to what you've been talking about, and that's notions of well-being, going beyond income. And in a sense, the discussion began in a way that was some doubt, but by the end, we were all convinced that this was both important and doable. The most important aspect of this, and I want to emphasize this, is if you're going to have reliable measurements, they have to be replicable. You're trying to get quantifications, but if they're replicable, that means that they're not just my judgments. Anybody else could do the same survey or the same approach and get a similar number. Not necessarily exactly the same, but it's replicable. So replicability is an important attribute. But the other important attribute is that the numbers that are generated have to be meaningful in the sense that they're related to other aspects of behavior. That we can say if this country has a certain attribute, a higher number, then there will be some consequences to that. And so that's one of the important things. And one of the things that is very clear is that one can get replicable measurements of a whole variety of phenomena, social phenomena, attitudes, and that these are meaningful, that they are systematically related to a whole host of predictable consequences. Some of this is now being related in some ongoing research to that there are bases, neurological bases of some of these things. I want to mention in this connection a couple things that some of which economists have talked about for a number of years, and some of which and non-economists, others, and also a couple of things that our commission talked about. One of my colleagues, when I was at Stanford, Tibor Skotowski wrote a very, very nice book where he tried to bring economics and psychology together. It was called The Joyless Society. And what? The Joyless Economy. The Joyless Economy. And one of the things he said in that book was that people both enjoy stimulation, excitement, but they also enjoy comfort. And that there was a tension. He described a tension between these two forces. So that on the one hand, yes, there was a dynamism that they valued, a change that they valued, but they also valued comfort on the other side. In a way, to go back to neurological research, there's a lot of work that's beginning to be understood about how stimuli lead to certain nerves being fired, and how patterns of that give pleasure in a certain way or give addiction. So that, and this is somebody remarked that information of this kind can be both powerful and dangerous. In some sense, the cigarette companies were trying to take advantage of this. They didn't have the deep neurological knowledge, but they had the behavioral knowledge, where they tried to deliberately induce addiction, because they learned what it was that gives the pleasure, gives people satisfaction, and they could actually chemically induce that. Now, interestingly, the same thing applies in other areas as well. I mean, that's what we try to teach in marketing in the business school, how to get people to be stimulated and respond by buying goods. One of the interesting areas of research is how these ideas on addiction have now been used in areas of food consumption. David Cassell has written this who was the FDA commissioner that stopped tobacco advertising and began the pursuit against the tobacco companies, has written a book talking about how food companies are doing the same thing in the area of food, where they're learning the stimulus response and designing food to get the stimulus response to get people to buy. So they get pleasure in a particular way, and how we think about that, I think, is very maybe very troublesome. There were two things that the commission talked about that are, I think, worth mentioning. One of them is, again, something that was picked up in a couple of the talks, was the importance of connectedness. Bob Putnam was a member of our commission, and he's written this book, Bowling Alone. And that systematically you can see you can measure connectedness. He's been spending a lot of time doing that. And he can show that there are all kinds of correlates with those measures of connectedness in terms of well-being and behavior. So that's very important. And the degree of connectedness is changing in our society, a way in which our society may be getting less well off, less happy. Another one, which is very salient today that we emphasized, is the importance of unemployment. That people, standard economic model, work is negative. People don't like to work, and enters into your utility function with a negative sign. And yet, what is clear is that the loss of a job is not replaced by giving somebody the income that they lost. There is a certain dignity to work, a place in our society, fulfillment, and that is one of the aspects of why we should be so concerned about the high level of unemployment, which is not just the official 9.1%, but if you looked at the disguised unemployment, part-time and voluntary unemployment, closer to 20% in the United States today, and among youth, even higher. And so there we have a pending real social problem. One of the things that I think was brought out by the Arab Spring and the protest in Tunisia, one of the things that they said is they were concerned about their loss of dignity and the unfairness of the system. It wasn't just the lack of jobs, but it was how the jobs were allocated. They weren't allocated in a fair way. They went to people who were connected to the party. And that, as much as the loss unemployment, gave rise to the discontent. And that's consistent. Again, this is work, there's actually some very interesting research, the work of Fair that was mentioned, on how important fairness is to individuals, in a way that's not consistent with rational models, rational selfish models that have been the cornerstone of economics. And they've tested this hypothesis that people really do care about fairness. And some people in social evolutionary theory talk about this as important for survival of the species. Let me just try to, one other topic, one other aspect that our commission emphasized throughout throughout our discussion of not only the standard criticisms, but also on these measures of well-being, is distribution. That how we think about distribution, and that's more complicated. Too often we look at distribution of separate things and not looking at the correlation. People who are deprived in income are also deprived in security, deprived in voice, deprived in a whole variety of ways, and so the social impact of that deprivation is even greater than would be reflected in just looking at one number like income inequality. And it's not just inequality, it's equality of opportunity. In the United States, we think of ourselves as a land of opportunity, but over the last 40 years, social mobility has decreased. At the same time, inequality has increased. So that, in fact, today, social mobility in the United States is lower than in some countries of old Europe. And that's something that we ought to think about. But clearly, these issues of social mobility are important for thinking about the sense of well-being of individuals, their sense of their prospects. But I want to emphasize, much of what I've talked about so far has been consistent with the economist's predilection, which is looking at everything through the eyes of individuals. But there's a sense in which a society in which there is lower social mobility, less opportunity, is a different society. And so it's not just the impact individual by individual, it's how the society as a whole interacts in a more complicated way. And so when we think about well-being, I think we ought to not just think about individual well-being, separately individual by individual, but how we organize our society for societal well-being. Finally, let me make a remark about what I think one of the functions of this kind of exercise is. One of the things that was already mentioned is that different people care about different things. One of the things that we care about is process, about participation. You know, economists, again, one of the criticisms is we put all the attention on the outcomes. In law, people very much care about fair due process. It's the procedures that are important as much as the outcomes. Now, you can say one of the reasons for that is that procedures are related to outcomes, but in a way, people want to have their voice heard. And even if the outcome isn't what they wanted, if their voice is heard, they feel better about it. It seems to me that one of the functions of having this kind of work is that it can be the basis of a dialogue in society that can help articulate the different things that different people care about. And then ask the question about, are our metrics really capturing what many people or most people think about? And if there's great divergence, we'll have to have more than one metric to reflect the diversity of view. If there's a consensus, then we might not have to have so many different views. But this is important in part because voting itself is not is necessary for democracy, but does not encapsulate all of democratic principles. The democratic principle is, at least the way a lot of us think about it, is a democratic process and participation in decision making. When I was chief economist at the World Bank, we did a study, interviewed 10,000 people. You know, you can't, when you're in university, you can't do things like that. We interviewed 10,000 poor people. It was called Voices of the Poor, and we wanted to know what it was that they cared about. What was it that made their life miserable? And as one would have thought, one of the things they listed was lack of income. But there were two others that they also emphasized. One was insecurity, and the third was lack of voice. So this is an important part of individuals' well-being. And so in our discussion of well-being, I don't think we can, we need to include somehow civic participation as part of our discussion. Finally, let me comment on the discussion that Ian Golding's remarks gave rise to about the economics profession, because in some ways it's related to these basic ideas. We should realize that by now, after the crisis, but economic theory has long pointed this out, that our economic system is not necessarily efficient, and it's not necessarily self-correcting. In other words, what sometimes technically called the Nash equilibrium of the system is often inefficient in a whole variety of ways. And this is the whole point of the market failures approach. And that's true not only macro, it's true micro. So if you look at academic departments, they have a Nash equilibrium, the system replicates itself, it can even be stable, but not necessarily efficient. And trying to figure out how you break out of that is very, very difficult. At the level of the macro level, we talk about government intervention correcting the market failures, but we also know that the government interventions themselves are subject to political economy failures. And the same thing, of course, is true at the micro level. But I think that one of the things that clearly has been left out of the economic profession is this broader concern about what is the meaning of well-being, what is the objective of the whole enterprise. And I think that's why I thank Ned for raising this issue and bringing it to all of our attention.
I think we have time for a couple of questions.
As long as they're friendly.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
You said somewhere back at the beginning, and I'm not exactly sure where. I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question. You said that there's no suitable, sufficient, adequate metric for measuring what we want to measure. And of course, I agree with that, 100%. But there are a couple of metrics that I'm fascinated by that resonate with me and make me feel like we're getting somewhere. I agree that life satisfaction is no good at all, and Marty Seligman, somewhere here, has exploded that. But I confess to a hankering for job satisfaction. And, you know, if you look at job satisfaction among the 18 or so senior members of the OECD, France is absolutely at the bottom, normalizing it's at 0. And Denmark and Canada and a few others are at the top. For me, this is meaningful. Sorry, but I think it's. I think this self-reporting is not meaningless, and we have ancillary other evidence to indicate that people are terribly unhappy in the workplace in France, and much happier, much happier in economies that are more open, that are more open to innovation, more open to experimentation, exploration, et cetera, et cetera. Now, and then the other thing is, if I can read my notes, this wonderful study, which Martin Seligman calls our attention to, by Huppert and So, which purports, okay, maybe it's no good, but it's better than nothing, It purports to measure the sense of flourishing. And Denmark shines, and I forget what the second or third country is. I'm sure the U.S. is not better than eighth or ninth or 10th. But, you know, at the bottom you have, guess what? France and Italy and some of those. How would you respond to that?
Okay. So there are two or three parts of the response. I mean, first, cross-country comparisons of this kind are very, very difficult. And the reason is
No, they're easy. You just ask them.
no, no. Say the meaning,
question is the
no,
meaning,
the
yeah.
meaning, the meaning of them. I mean, you can get there are cultural attributes that you see in studies that say some societies report greater unhappiness. Whether they really unhappy? Well, you know, societies in some, it's very difficult to tell. This is the whole point of the difficulty of interpersonal utility comparisons. You can look at certain characteristics. If they commit more suicide, that begins to give you a behavioral indicator. But even then, that may not be good, a good indicator. We know that even in the United States, in places where there's no sun and it rains all the time, people are unhappier and they commit suicide more often. So that there are other conditions that can lend to differences in cultural attitudes within a region. The second point I want to raise is the point that Ian made, which is it makes a difference what kinds of jobs people are engaged in. And that's going to have to do with the sectoral composition. Now, the least happy often, typically, are those who are unemployed. So if a society isn't able to deliver jobs, then there's a problem. And the stress on families and all that is enormous. So to me, that's a very high on the list. If you have a rich society that's been able to outsource a good fraction of the nasty jobs to China and keeps all the good jobs at home, of course people, and they are well educated, then of course they're going to be somewhat happier than doing work that is hard and unpleasant. So I think one has to take into account a little bit of the industrial composition. I think that it may well be, let me say finally, that the structure of an economy, like whether you have small businesses or big businesses, i.e. whether individuals are within a hierarchy or not within a hierarchy, can affect well-being. And so those attributes, which include creating new jobs, are important. So I don't want to deny the importance of these other characteristics, and they can be, you know, very, I would say, very important for the well-being of those few individuals who are going to be able to partake of these innovative economy, and of more individuals if they get jobs in small enterprises that have a greater sense of identity than in a large anonymous organization.